telephone number. The telephone number is 077 488 55055, or you can ring us on the landline, which is 0116 4822 086. Now, today's show that we're going to be talking about with Anila and myself is discussing the idea of navigating through marriage, potentially divorce, and single parenthood. And we have our two guests in the studio today, Zainab and Shamim. And before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Anila, because as my co-host, often, you think of us as just hosts, and we are questioning and interviewing other people. But Anila, in background, is a solicitor in family law, and she works for Right Justice Solicitors. So tell me, Anila, tell me a little bit about your background and why you decided to go into law.
Assalamu alaikum, Naila. It's a bit funny sitting in this side of the studio. So I studied quite a few years ago, did my degree the normal way, A-levels degree, LPC, and then I did my training contract and became a solicitor. And then I worked for a couple of years, and then I got married and had children, took quite a bit of a break. And then I've come back into it. I really do enjoy it. A lot of children, a lot of 18, 19-year-olds do ask me a lot about the profession. It's very exciting, family law. It is quite dramatic at times. It's a lot of fun. But I think also it suits a particular type of person, because family law is not like normal law where aggression works. Family law, it's conciliatory in nature. It's about what's good for the children. It's about what's good for the person who's the victim. And I would say, in a way, you have a supportive role. It's not just about the client, even though your client is your client. You have to look at it in its totality, because you are dealing with, marriage, people together, partners, children.
So it's quite holistic.
There's a lot at stake, yeah, and it really. So I personally really enjoy it.
So can I just ask you, Anila? I know that there's some changes in the law that's recently happened, and I wanted to ask you about 2 or 3 of them, if I can. And the first one is, coercive control. So obviously there's been changes in terms of how that's defined and how that's impacted on all kinds of relationships. Could you broaden us a little bit in the audience about that?
So domestic violence itself is illegal, as you know, and coercive control comes within that. We're one of a few countries that includes coercive control. By definition, it's a lot like domestic violence, but it also includes things that you can't really see. So not bruising, like what you would normally associate with domestic violence. So things would be like isolating you from your family, monitoring your activities, monitoring your phone, watching not giving you money or giving you a certain amount of money, installing cameras to watch who comes and goes.
So it's a form of intimidation.
Yes, it is. And like I said, with domestic violence as the biggest umbrella, that includes all physical and verbal. And it was coercive control was needed because it includes the things that you don't necessarily see.
So it's more like it's a mind game.
Yeah, it also includes things like gaslighting, not necessarily, like I said, physical violence or verbal violence, things that, the bystander would be able to point out and say, oh, I see what you're doing. It could be somebody going to the shops and buying something that's, far less than what they can afford because they know it's going to get them into trouble. So it's something like that. Obviously, it's accumulative. It can't just be the one time, where you're having money problems and you can't afford something. It's got to
be put in a perspective and a context.
Absolutely. Just like with everything. I mean, our religion is beautiful, and when it comes to marriage, it is supposed to be about peace and tranquility. And I think that, as Muslims, it's something that we should, when dealing with marriage, especially nowadays, with the youngsters, whereby, they don't have the cultural sensitivities that we had, as well as the religious ones. It's something that I think needs to be taught as a subject before the children are engaging in marriage.
I agree. So that brings me to some of the ayats of the Quran. So it says, for example, verily women are the counterparts of men, and that's in Surah Nahl. And then, and of his signs, that is that he created for you from yourselves mates that you will find tranquility in them, and place between you affection and mercy. And indeed, that is the signs of the people who give thought. And that's in Surah Ar-Rum in verse 30, Surah 30, verse 21. And what that's saying is that marriage is supposed to be something that's supposed to be loving, enriching, and encouraging. And that draws me to another question that I wanted to ask you about. Is that, when you talk to young people today, wouldn't you say that, they read about the surah, about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his wives, then they have all the stuff that they learn in school, the literature, the Romeo and Juliet, the poems, the music, the social media, and
the PHSE sessions.
Exactly. And then you've got your parents, the bikra, and then you're sort of in this situation where they're all on a feminist trip and say they don't want to get married. What do you say to that then, Shamim? What's your view on that? Do you feel that people feel a little bit sort of ambivalent about marriage?
Assalamu alaikum. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, that that the experience that a lot of young people have at home is quite a contrast to the fantasy that they read about, that they get obsessed about with Netflix and Instagram and what they see on social media. And so when they get married, I think some people build up that big day as the be-all and end-all. And then when reality hits and the hardships come along, which any experienced or actually any newlywed will tell you are actually quite different, that you don't see in literature often if you're not reading the right things. You won't see on social media if you're not following those kind of people. You might not see them in films. When those kind of hardships hit, then all of a sudden that illusion is broken. And then it for some people, I think it seems irreparable.
Do you think there's unrealistic expectations about, maybe there's too much of a build-up of the day, and then there's not a huge amount of literature? I mean, obviously in Islam there is, but do we think that we're investing enough about beyond the build-up of the relationship? What do you say about that, Zainab?
I don't think there's a lot. There's a lot of marital courses that people can go on, but I don't think there's awareness, and I think the education primarily does start from home. So if you don't have two emotionally regulated adults who show, it's all fine and dandy saying we're not going to argue in front of the children. But if they don't see you patch up your differences and don't see you apologize to each other for your shortcomings or any kind of fractured thing inside the house, they're not going to know how to deal with the bigger picture after marriage. Everything is aesthetically pleasing right now to youngsters. They're programmed, they're conditioned with their media. Everything's available on the touch of a finger. They can go through everything. There's not a lot of patience. So if you want to buy something, you click onto something and your phone automatically buys it for you. So what does that teach them? Instant gratification.
Of course.
And so when they want something later on in marriage, there's no patience. There's no sense of I need to wait for this, or it's not going to happen the way that I want it. There's no working together, and even society shows that a woman can do this and a man can do this, and the paths can kind of cross. But primarily, it's your journey, and it's like women do one thing, men do another. But where's the togetherness in it? And that's where I think things go wrong, because when a problem happens, I keep thinking, often I do say to my own husband that, let's work through it together.
I think you've raised a really important point. So let me bring you back into the conversation here, Anila. So tell me, when you have to deal with couples where their situation is becoming quite tense, what would be your advice when you think that things are starting to get really stressful? At what point, what would you advise couples who may be feeling that the relationship is becoming quite strained? What would you suggest?
So before we take any matter to court, we have to go through a mediation process, which is specific to family law, and it's called a Mayam mediation. And that's something that everybody has to undertake, or at least attempt to undertake, before it can be taken to court. Now, as a Muslim, what I would suggest is first and foremost to find somebody who's independent of both of you, somebody who loves you both, respects you both, and wants you both to be together, not somebody who's your best friend.
Who's going to side you?
Yeah, not your best friend, not your parents. I have a lot of clients whose parents are heavily involved, and no matter how saintly you are, it's very difficult to detach yourself from the hurt of your child. And therefore, I advise the parents who are listening as well that, look, I appreciate you want to help your child, but the best way to help your child is allow them to navigate it for themselves with support, but please don't egg them on, because a lot of the parents, I'm finding that a lot of the parents are taking, oh, he said this, or he did that. And actually taken out of context, it can seem really bad. And which parent would not want to protect its child? But in the context of marriage, it's really important to see the bigger picture. And there's always two sides.
Okay, so you just talked about the parents there. So again, I want to just bring the question back to you, Shamim. How do you feel that, as a person who's been married, often people sort of demonize in-laws. Do you feel that relationship can be something that can be fruitful, beneficial, and, something that can be enriching?
Absolutely. I'm coming up to, I think, the 20th year of my marriage, and to say that it's not been easy, right? And I don't think any relationship, though, is. In this world, every relationship is a blessing, but it also comes with hardship as well. And I think where marriage and the relationship with in-laws can be portrayed quite negatively and stereotyped, I also think there's another side to it, which, depending on your perspective and also the people that you are with, it can actually be it can actually become a strength in your marriage as well. I'm married into a house where I was the youngest person to get married. My husband was a middle child, and I thought it was challenging because I thought I've got a lot to live up to here. But actually they were welcoming, they were understanding. My in-laws live in India, and I do have some here as well. But when I did call my mother-in-law and father-in-law over from India 2 years into our marriage, my stress levels hit an all-time high, because I thought, they've raised daughters and daughter-in-laws who are well established as cooks, can run households. I'm working. How is it going to work? But actually, my mother-in-law came into the kitchen after my husband gently pushed her my way and said to me, she watched me cook, and she said, you're absolutely fine. And the one thing she told me, and she has told me again and again, is that no one is born from their mother's womb knowing how to be perfect. Sure. She goes, I'll still make mistakes. She goes, I'm reaching the age of 80 and I'll still do it. And later on, after I had my child and I worried about weight gain, and she looked at her own stomach and she said to me, so look at mine. Oh. And she told me, she said, who's perfect, right? And she said, all you can do is just try. And she said, the rest is as Allah wills it. Mashallah. And my sister-in-laws as well used to always say that, their brother always looked happy. And as long as he was, then that's all that mattered. As long as we both looked happy, actually. Because there were times when if somebody, most people who know me know that I went through infertility issues. And during that time, if we did visit India and somebody would make a comment, my sister-in-laws would have them. They never stood a chance. And they sometimes wouldn't even let those comments get back to me. They just get upset. And then I'd find out that, okay, somebody has said something. But likewise, it's not all been them. I've worked equally hard as well. So when issues started, when you go into a family, right, if you see them as in-laws, then you create division. But if you see them as the extension to your husband, which is how I chose to see mine, then every time there was an issue, at first my husband would actually just say, right, I'm dealing with it. And then I actually did feel like an outsider then, very early on in our marriage. And then I said to him, if you talk to me about it, I'll probably be able to help. And after that, we both started working through everything together. So whether it was something at my own house or at his house, even if it was all the way in India or up north or wherever it was, we would wait until we talked to each other, then try to talk to the people involved, and then always try to make a solution. And like that, not only did everything become a bit easier, but actually we created quite a strong bond as well. But it also gave faith to my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my parents that, that this was a relationship that everyone could rely on.
But it also sets a good template, though, doesn't it? Because it sets out this idea that marriage can work, and it's all about building and working on those relationships. Sometimes I think that, when you get married, people automatically think you're going to click together, and it's just like, it's all music and poetry and all the, and the other person intuitively. And I think that that's how it's perceived. But actually, you have to get to know that person. You're two strangers. You're two imperfect people who are trying to start a perfect journey that will take you, inshallah, to Jannah. Which then
definitely.
So that brings me to
definitely.
You, and that brings me to you, Zainab. Can I just ask you? So tell me about your journey, about when you decided that marriage was going to be something that you were going to think about.
So I think the first time around, I don't think I was emotionally or mentally ready to get married.
Was that something that your parents suggested?
It's basically you get that vibe of relatives and your friends.
That it's your time.
Everyone's getting married, and you know what? You're next in line. I have an older brother and sister before me, so once they were married, then obviously everyone was looking to me, and you just kind of expect it. You sort of go into those. You kind of you become pliable to the norms, and so I just went with it. But yeah, when I went into the marriage, I didn't know what to expect. I did like my husband. I did love him a lot. But then you're 23. What do you know about love? You don't understand that when something happens, if you're going to go through any financial difficulty, how are you going to behave at that time? Because before you get married, you don't know what to expect. You just have this ideal in your head. And a lot of my friends had been married before me, and they seemed fine. They had their homes. In-laws issues was very minimal because they lived separate. But they also had they had kind of everything was stable. So when I experienced turbulence in my own marriage, I was like, maybe everyone else is hiding as well. And I didn't let on that this is what I was going through. So the first time around, there was a lot of abuse, and obviously being that young, you don't recognize coercive control for what it is.
So let me just ask you as a question here, Anila. At what point do you think that, at this situation, at this point in time, how long do you feel that people need to be sitting in this situation for them to then think that maybe they need to do something different? I mean, did you get perspective at all? I mean, did you have an opportunity to think, step out of the situation, like, be with family? Did somebody say to you, look, this is not how it should be? I mean, Shamim, what was your response to any of this? When you saw your sister?
Well, the first few times, when she would approach me and we'd discuss anything, I think part of my job means that I always try to step out of any relationship, and I try to see things objectively, because I think that seeing it objectively is the only way you can actually see a full situation. And then I would step out and say, okay, so you're telling me about the argument, you tell me what he said, now tell me what you said. So I wouldn't blame, but I did try to, at first, when you think, okay, it's a new marriage, arguments happen and things do get tense and it causes heartbreak. So I did try to explain, but then over time, I think I started realizing that I can soothe her mind. I can explain to her. She can try things. But if we don't get down to, where the mindset is the problem, then, and that means then negotiating with the other person, then you can't really move forward, because helping a relationship isn't just one-sided. You do have to try and make both sides see what the issue is, and perhaps what their own characters and personalities and ways of thinking or actually doing, why it's causing a problem.
So like your speaker says, it's absolutely the case that it is an individual basis. So for instance, I have a lot of clients who are from abroad, and abroad, for instance, capital punishment to give your child a bit of a tap is not a big deal, and then when they come here, it's very difficult for them to get out of there because they were brought up that way. So it's not something you can just switch on and switch back off. And like your speaker was saying, it's really important that you identify if there's a pattern. And now they're known as red flags, but I think if you early on, like your speaker was saying, when she had issues early on in her marriage, and she sat down and had the conversation with the husband that, look, let's do this as a team, let's talk about it, let's have a way in disagreeing, because every marriage, every relationship There will always be disagreements. You're not always going to see eye to eye. There's going to be issues. But the key is how you deal with that. And I've always said, and I've known Naila for a very long time, and I've always, and Naila and I have discussed this quite a lot. We've always said that we need to be taught how to argue and fight, and that doesn't mean physically, but to have your say, but in the most respectful, polite way, whereby you're not being shut up.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of relationships where I think that, and I've talked about this before, where I feel that, when you're dealing with students in the classroom or where you're dealing with families in general, that there's a difference in terms of the gender socialization. So boys are brought up to feel that there's no boundaries, that somehow they're special, and that there's no checking going on through the whole process. So when they approach school, for example, they're not in a position where they can accept no. And then when a wife comes along into the situation, or children come into the role, they see the relationship as one of, I am the superior. And that I call that the Shazad effect. And what happens is that they feel that I can do anything.
It's entitlement, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a toxic masculinity that's involved here. And that can filter through in lots of different relationships. And that can be a starting point in terms of how people feel about their relationship. So if you're going into a relationship where people are socialized that way, and that you're seen to be not equal. Also, I've noticed as well, and I don't know whether you agree with me on this one, Anila, is that, we live in a society where your worth is based on money. So because if you're a wife or a mother in Islam, we've given a high elevation because of motherhood, of becoming a childbearer, all the ayats of the Quran and the hadith about that. And yet Western society demonizes that and says that your monetary value only comes from you being able to work.
Well, I would go beyond that, and I'd say it's not just Western society. Unfortunately, the jobs like being a mother, I was actually listening to something and they were saying that, in Islam, we're not equal. We're not equal. We're actually supposed to complement each other. We're actually supposed to respect each other's roles and not interchange them, Things work differently. Everybody's different. You can come up with your own plan. But to assert one job on one person is not fair. There has to be support. There has to be conflict resolution. And I really do think that the masajids can really help on this as well. So when we have madrasa lessons, it would be really nice if they could include something in regards to conflict resolution. Because like you said, it's not just in marriage. This can happen with all, especially in this country, we have a lot of teenagers, and parents' issues, which, it really do need looking at, because a lot of our teenagers...
you have a lot of mummy daddy issues, and then that reflects again in relationships. Again, I have this as well with my clients, where people will come in and say, I want to divorce my wife, and I say, well, what's the reason behind it? And they will say things like, my wife every month feels like, she can't cook, she can't stand, she feels a little bit weak. And I said, right, okay, did you do science?
That's another one.
Then they will say, well, my mum never felt like this. I said, well, your mum's not going to talk about her menstrual cycle to you, but your wife might do, because it's a different relationship. And she may have felt all of those things. She just didn't share that with you. And therefore, you need to open the mind a little bit to the way in which women work. Also, I think another factor that's really important, again, that I've noticed psychologically, is that a healthy relationship often works where a woman's needs are met, emotionally, financially, and physically, in terms of
happy life.
There you go. And if that's done, then you being able to be that supportive person with the husband then becomes easy. Yeah. So if everybody accepts their roles, it works better.
Yeah.
So let me just bring the conversation back to you, Zainab. So you were talking about your marriage, and you were saying that you started seeing some red flags.
And I wasn't aware of them at that time. I had to leave the marriage for me to see all the red flags. But I started to reckon, I didn't even know at that time that I was being manipulated. And if my sister's on the phone, she'll know. I was a very strong-willed person. I felt like my spirit had literally broken in that time. Even now when I think about it, I'm actually quite a strong person, but even now when I think about it, I was taken from a person who knew how to speak her mind to just kind of becoming a shell. And I then made my world really small, and he helped do that. So I made my world just about my kids. I cut myself off from my sister, my brother, my mum and dad. I didn't reach out to anyone. I just made sure that it was just me and my kids. I didn't have the mental space to deal with anything else. And I still remember it was in Ramzan. And Ramzan is such a precious moment to me because as in Ramzan, I was sitting and I just felt like, okay, I need to ask Allah for help. And I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if there's a shaitaniyat in my marriage, take it away. Literally the next day, my marriage broke up.
So what was the turning point for you, Zainab? What made you feel that, you know, you were saying that you stayed in that marriage for a couple of years, you've got 3 children, mashallah. And what was the point at which you felt, right, I've got to do something?
It was taken out of my hands because he actually left. He threw me out. I had 3 children and he goes, just take the kids and go. And so I did. And but it was my own home. So that was my home. That was my physical home. I've had it since before I got married. So it's my home. So obviously then the legal process kicked in. And even then I still wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to leave him because there was a year that we weren't together. And in that time, my family worked really hard to build me up. I had an amazing support network.
Sure.
But at the same time, something had to change within myself. I had to stop seeing myself as a victim. So when he then came in the hope that we could reconcile, so we went together from 1 July to the following spring. So it was about March, April time, exactly this time. And I had my uncles there, I had my parents there, and he had I think he had someone from his side. He came to reconcile. He goes, you know, there will be changes made or whatever. My parents said, you need to get some kind of therapy for your anger management. And he was like, I'm not willing to do that.
So he was dismissive of the fact that the marriage, that he needed help.
Yeah. And I was sitting opposite him and I just realized in that moment, like my parents threw him a lifeline. They said, if you accept that you need help, you're welcome to come back into her life. And I still remember, my brother turned to him and he goes, there was financial abuse, there was there was physical abuse, and there was definitely emotional abuse, because she wasn't like this before. She became a completely different person when she was married to you. And I was sitting opposite this person and I was thinking, do I really want him back in my life? There was this moment that I just had this thing because there was 2 things he did. He denied physical violence while sitting opposite me, knowing full well that the first 2 children that I had with him almost didn't make it because of the doctors gave my firstborn 48 hours to live. And then with the second one, they said that there's so much trauma to your womb that there's a chance you may need to abort the child.
And this was because of the domestic violence?
Yeah. And I still didn't pick up that, okay, it's him, because he kept saying, it's because you're not eating properly. You're not eating properly. But when you're in that situation, you can't eat. Like everything becomes a chore to you. And I didn't even know that I was actually depressed. I didn't even know that I was such an angry, depressed person. Much later, my sister said to me, she goes, you became really brittle. The way that I spoke, I lost all kindness, all my softness, everything, it just went.
Because you were in survival mode.
Yeah, fight, flight. That's what happens. Your fight, flight gets triggered. And it's like sexual abuse victims, you know, in that moment, until you don't heal from it, you're always on guard. Always. You see everyone as an attacker. And that's what I saw. I never saw that some people were saying good for me because I kept thinking everything is a setup. And it wasn't until much later that I got diagnosed with PTSD. And I was like, that's what it is. And then I started obviously doing my own healing and working through it. I got help. And it's really difficult to get a faith-aligned trauma therapist, someone who knows. So that's when I started doing the work that I do. And
which is what?
So I work as a practitioner in well-being, like healing. It's a healing modality called Afia healing. And we have to commit to 120 case studies before we can become a practitioner. We have to learn about the psychosomatics. And one of the things that I learned was that my lower back was actually breaking. I had a slip disc. When you look at the emotions behind the lower back, it's lack of support, financial abuse, sexual abuse. There's so much in it. And I'd gone through so much of it. And I was like, okay, I need to heal from that. And it took about a year. And then suddenly one day, from not being able to walk, I was able to walk again.
So there is a lot of psychology around the physical manifestations of mental trauma. So a lot of women will go to see the doctor and say, oh, my arm is hurting, my stomach's hurting, I've got IBS, you know, I've got rash, I've got headaches. And a lot of that is a manifestation of all the trauma, because women often, you know, they internalize a lot of trauma. whereas men tend to externalize?
Well, it's a bit like the sister was saying, that she didn't realize anything was wrong because she was being told, oh, it's because you're not eating.
He was dismissing.
They also tend to mess around with your reality. So you then have a distorted idea of reality. So when people like your sister is trying to help you, you then become suspicious of them because you're like, okay, what is she out to get me? And you become that type of person. And that's why it's really important that, you know, people do not isolate from their families, and also that they go into marriage knowing the signs of coercive control.
So I just wanted to ask you, Zainab, you know, at some point, obviously, you separated from your husband. What was the impact on your children, and how did you navigate becoming a single parent? And what was the society in response to any of that?
So I was a single parent way before the divorce anyway, before the initial separation and the divorce, because I did everything. His was very basic. When I wasn't around for 3 days of the week. So I was, because I used to work 3 p.m. to 11. And he would then just do the basics, as in when the child's come back from school, sort them out with food and then put them to bed. And his evening was over by the time it was 7. So I was still breastfeeding my baby at that stage. So I would feed the baby thoroughly and then go to work and such. So I still see now, because my second husband's very hands-on with the kids, I kind of see now that I was still operating as a single parent back then, because anything to do with the kids, I was doing it. You know, even financially supporting the kids, I was doing it. So I kind of had, I was better. I was actually a better unit because there was none of this going on.
So in some sense, you were managing a very difficult situation with a challenging situation as the partner.
Mm.
But once the partner went, did that just kind of release the pressure almost?
Yeah, because by then I was allowed a relationship. It took me a while to accept help. So like I would be incredibly shy about asking for help. I would be like, I've got this, I can do this. I would never tell my parents that I was financially struggling until I think one day they came in and they saw that my cupboards were empty of food and I'd been feeding my kids. I'd been trying to be very creative with eggs the whole week. And I was like, this is what I'm going to manage. I can do this until payday. I'm cool with this. But then they came in and they saw that I had very little meat. And so they did an entire shop for me. And I was like, why did you do that? I kept it together until they went. And then I started to cry. I was like, oh my God, you know, I've got to get out of this. I was really shy about asking for help. But my sister, my brother, I had an amazing support network where they would be like, no, we're going to do the masterminds. We'll make it easy for you. We'll do this for you. We'll do that for you. And I wasn't just managing my kids.
You're trying to bring yourself back. You're trying to put all the fragments back together to make you a whole person again, and that's going to take a time of healing, inshallah.
Absolutely. And I don't think I was even fully healed until when I married my second husband, but I had a good mindset. So healing is a constant journey. It's never, you know, even like
you don't just wake up one day and say, that's it, I'm healed.
Exactly.
It takes time to recover from some trauma like that, because you probably went into that marriage thinking, you know, I'm investing for the rest of my time with this person and it's not worked. And it's going to put doubts in your mind. It's going to make you lose your confidence. You know, the parent that's left behind with 3 kids is going to be the person that everybody's going to be looking at. And you don't want to crack under the pressure, because you kind of almost feel like I need to pull it together, because if I don't, then how are the kids going to cope?
I think by the time I got married the second time, I was very liberated and I no longer cared what people thought of me.
Now, let me just ask you again about that. How did the response of the community about the fact that, you know, the relationship?
Oh gosh. So when you first get divorced, you need an incredibly thick skin. You know, people say so many things to you, and it comes from your own. It comes from your relatives. It comes from even friends. It comes from people who come across with the best of intentions, as in they're very sweet, and then the poison strikes. So things that have been said to me is, you know, if he was so bad, how did you manage to have 3 kids with him?
What a question.
Or why did you not leave after the first slap? Okay, so it's like telling someone
it's your fault.
They're questioning you about something very personal in a public space, out of nosiness, not out of concern or support.
And there was I'm so sorry you went through that. This is really sad, but I actually got more support from my non-Muslim professional colleagues than I did from our community. My manager at that time, she goes, Zainab, she took me to the side and she goes, you're not the same, I can tell. She goes, if there's anything I can do financially to help you, because I know you're on minimum hours for the sake of your kids, I can give you something and then you can pay it back to me whenever you're ready.
So you would have preferred it, instead of people coming around to nose about your business, is to provide the Islamic, mashwara and support that you needed. So let me just bring Shamim back into the situation. So Shamim, tell me, when, your sister separated from her husband, did you find that people made comments?
Oh, definitely. We would go out to weddings and things where Zainab would be very reluctant, and me and my mom would be like, no, get dressed, get all done up, like you should, and we're going together, you'll be fine. And the very first wedding reception we went to, Zainab was, we're always offering help, and that, especially if it's a family thing. So Zainab was offering people tea or water or something, and this lady who knew both sides, suddenly started saying, oh, you should have kept it together and done sabr. I'm only saying it for the sake of the kids. When I turned over, I gave Zainab a couple of minutes to sort of see if she's okay. And when I realized Zainab's hands were shaking, I quickly got up and just went to her, told Zainab, go back. And then I told the lady that, when your daughter comes back and tells you the things that she's gone through, please make sure you let me know how it felt when you said the same words to her. And she looked so embarrassed. And she said, oh no, I was only saying it for the sake of the kids. And I said, and it's for the sake of the kids that she's walked away. Now, if you can't understand that, then it doesn't matter. But because I think we were always together, the children were healthy, Zainab looked happy, people just couldn't understand, because she didn't fit the stereotype that we expect of women, divorce, so she should be hiding in the house.
And why should she? Because Islam makes it easy that if situation doesn't work well. And that brings me back to the next point, that, because in Islam it says that, if a marriage isn't going to work, you should leave each other with justice.
So the verse is Surah Al-Baqarah 2:29, where it says, live with them honorably, and that's a big thing, honor, or let them go with kindness. So when you let someone go, you let them go with kindness. And the thing with our families and community is that there's a lot of pitting against each other. Don't let him see the kids until he does this. Don't let her, don't give her a penny until she does this. I was completely cut loose, completely. Financially, I had literally zero help from my ex-husband. So I had to, I didn't know where his whereabouts was. He went completely off grid. So I thought, risk was never from him anyway. If Allah chose him to be a form of provision for me, he would have done it during the course of our marriage. And I was like, I'm going to do this. One of the most beautiful things my brother said to me is, when a woman provides for her children, she's earning her Jannah because she's doing something that she actually doesn't have to do. And he goes, so this way, Zainab, you're earning your Jannah. Whatever shortcomings there are, may they be forgiven, you're earning your Jannah. And you know what? That was one of my biggest motivating factors. And I just picked myself up. I stopped counting the pennies, basically. And I started to see everything as, okay, so I have to put 2 children in childcare. That's fine. That's an additional £1,000 a month. That's fine. I'm doing the best I can. I stopped beating myself up over the things that I didn't have, and I focused on the things that I did have, which was stability, which was reliability,
peace of mind.
And
safety.
Yeah, safety. That was a big thing. Like, I would never leave my children. I still don't leave my children. There's a very small circle of people I leave my children with. And I still don't, because I always think that they're my responsibility, they're my amanat, and I cannot have anyone, because I still know people talk about me, and I can't have my children exposed to that. I won't.
So how have your children managed the relationships now? Like, obviously you're now a blended family, you've remarried, and how did you approach the whole situation with your new husband? Did you explain to him the situation that you'd come from? How did he respond to the fact? Were you frank about that whole situation with him?
I was very frank. I basically put down my non-negotiables. I said to him that, look, I'm a single mom. Tread carefully before I even introduce you to my children. There's some things that you're going to need to know. This is what I won't tolerate. Screaming, shouting, chucking things around the house. If you have anger issues, guess what? You go in the car and you scream it out. You find yourself a therapist and you recover from whatever it was that hurt you, but I'm not here to mother you. The same way that I don't expect to be fathered, I'm not here to be mothered. And also non-negotiables, you raise a hand on me, I'll break them. I was very frank. I said, I'll make you pay hell for any time you hurt me, if it's physically and emotionally. I said, and by the way, I can recognize emotional abuse and it's not going to happen. And I told him that, look, you've come out of a very fractured relationship yourself. Are you sure you're okay to be with me?
So you both healed together?
I think I'm definitely more, alhamdulillah, by Allah's will. I think I'm more centered and emotionally regulated than my husband, but I definitely think he's got the better character because he's got a lot of patience. So whilst he's really hurt, he didn't know what he was suffering from until I pointed it out. And obviously, you know this, you never want to go into your marriage as a therapist. You obviously want to be seen as a wife as well.
But it's also important that, I always said this before, that, friendships should be some factor within marriage, but it should also be a process of perspective. So whenever you're having that moment where things are a little bit out of control, it should always be a scenario where you can be looking at the situation in perspective, which brings me back to you, Anila. So in this situation, what would you advise people who are going through these kind of difficulties? What would you advise in terms of moving things forward, whether it's staying together, separating, or the kids?
So it was like you were saying that a lot of that you could see the coercive control once you were out of the situation, and that's why I think it's really important that one of the biggest signs is if you're being isolated, like you were saying, that if you feel that your life has now become you and your kids and that's it, that is isolation. That is isolation. As a woman, as a person, as an insan, you need people. And you need to make sure you've got good people who love you, who respect you. And when people say to you, you've changed, sit back, don't get triggered, sit back and think, okay, in a good way, in a bad way, what's actually changed? But you do need, like the sister over the phone was saying, that if she hadn't seen her sister, if the family hadn't come over and seen the empty cupboards, they would have been none the wiser because you were so good at hiding it. So it's really important that as a family, or people who have women in their family who are married, especially earlier on, because some of the signs are so obvious, but because you're so in love, you don't tend to see them, or you negate them, or you forgive them too quickly. And it's important that you work on yourself, like you were saying. Healing is something that I would say is basically being aware of you forever, not just whilst you're married.
I think it's very important for women because, again, I have a lot of clients where this happens, where what happens in the scenario is that they get married quite young and it's all about the kids, husband's at work. Then suddenly the kids get married, they move on, and then you're at home with the husband and you've spent so much time away from that individual. Then suddenly you realize, I've lost myself. And the husband turns around and says, well, you've changed. Well, I just became everything that everybody wanted me to be. That person who could perfectly clean everything, the person who can entertain and make all those lovely meals. I am that person that you wanted me to be. Well, I've lost myself in that whole process. And then you have a mental breakdown. And you then have panic attacks, anxiety, the IBS, the irritation, all of those things. And inevitably, that then leads to a lot of mental health problems. And a lot of women get to a certain age where they feel like they're almost like you're compromising a lot of the time. You're masking a lot of the time. You're compensating for all the loss. And I've often said that, I feel like I'm at a Titanic. I've said this before. And they say, what do you mean? I said that if I go down, everybody else is going down. And there's a huge pressure. As a woman, parent, there is,
especially as a mother, you are keeping it together.
And what ends up happening is people say to you, do you ever get this conversation? You're always tired. What? You're sitting on your phone. Why are you tired? Because it's like A&E, okay, as a parent, wouldn't you say? It's like, there's not 1 minute where you're not thinking, oh, that cupboard's not empty, I haven't got the milk, okay, I've got to put the dishwasher on, the washing machine, the dogs, the lights, etc., blah, blah, blah. So bearing that in mind. Now, I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our show, inshallah. Now, next week, we're going to be doing education, and we're going to be discussing the A to Z from year 6 right up until university and looking at all the options that are available. I hope you can join into that show, and I just want to thank again our guests Shamim and Zainab and Anila. I hope that we can learn a little bit more about law, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to do so.
If anybody needs support, there's Muslim Women's Helpline, Women Aid, Survivors UK, Men's Advice Line, free legal advice from universities, citizens advice, and I think Right Justice Solicitors do a free 15 minutes